We all want to implement AI and other great modern topics in our companies, but often you also need niche providers for that. And these niche providers who may have been working intensively on their topic for the past 3 years are often not so well positioned when it comes to information security. You can't really expect otherwise, because if you have a company with 5 to 25 people, where are you supposed to get the capacity for that? And you can't just assign someone to focus exclusively on information security.
Welcome to Cybersecurity Shall Be C-Level Priority, the podcast that puts the digital world to the test. Cyber attacks are on the rise, and data is the most valuable asset in today's world. But how can we protect what matters most to us? Drawing on the latest insights, effective strategies, and practical tools, we'll show you how to create a more secure digital environment. Because one thing is clear: security isn't negotiable. It's a top priority.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of Cybersecurity Chefsack, the podcast. Today with Katia. Hi, Katia.
Hi, Nico.
You were about to say something right away. You can see we're perfectly in sync, but that's even better. Why don't you tell us a few sentences about yourself? Who are you?
Gladly. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really happy that we can continue our discussion from the Cybersecurity Summit in Hamburg today. I'm Katia. I recently swapped the Elbe for the Rhine and moved from Hamburg to Cologne. I still have a bit of heartache for Northern Germany, as I'm sure you can understand, but I'm staying true to cybersecurity. I've been doing this for a little over 10 years now, and of course I'm continuing in Cologne. In Hamburg, I held the position of Information Security Officer at various financial service providers and also at Hamburg Airport, where together with great and highly competent colleagues, I was able to advance information security both technically and organizationally. And currently I'm in Cologne at Zurich Insurance in the organization and support of the entire security assessment processes, their further development, the further support, implementation and translation of the regulatory frameworks, above all DORA, and to a lesser extent, the Cyber Resilience Act. And I am happy to be here today.
Before we start with the topic, a very important question. Moin or moin moin?
Moin.
Very good. That was the crucial question, right? I always say moin moin is just chatter and moin is always for the right people. But all right, aside from moin, and of course I can absolutely relate to that. I've also traveled all over Germany and always ended up coming back to Neu Germany. It's always something very special. But today let's get started with the topic. And it's something quite unique because normally for those who know the podcast, there's always a poll. There are 3 topics, we present them and so on. But since Katia and I were thinking about the timing and thought, nope, we still want to record the episode. And as you already mentioned, we've talked about this at length at the Cybersecurity Summit. So we just spontaneously decided there won't be a poll this time because we actually find all the topics interesting. And we're actually starting with the topic of supply chain, which was also the topic we discussed the most. And we're throwing all of this together with the Cyber Resilience Act, and then we're adding another layer. What does the regulatory landscape actually look like, right? And how can you monitor regulations? But before we unpack all of this, maybe we should start with the term itself. What exactly is a supply chain?
A supply chain, of course, includes all service providers and services that deliver anything related to IT for us as a company, daily as a service, but also as information. I think that's really important, and it's something that many people still don't fully understand. Because even a service provider who doesn't necessarily just provide IT systems can be important in terms of information security. And of course, that also applies to other service providers. Information in whatever form, even purely physical, are important and must be checked. And that's exactly what we do and have to do when considering the supply chain. I think in the area of sustainability, everyone has become aware of this by now. It's been widely reported in the media that various sustainability aspects must be considered from a regulatory perspective. But this actually also applies to information security.
Now, to be a bit provocative, what I always find difficult about this topic of the supply chain, I'm completely with you that we have to do it. But as we already discussed beforehand, the issue is, to what extent do I apply all of this, right? You've already mentioned that you've worked at some major banks and now also at the airport, which are, let's say, larger companies. But what I keep noticing also in my job is that sometimes the supply chain also involves someone who I don't want to say has never heard of cybersecurity, because that would be wrong. I think nowadays everyone knows what it's about, not necessarily in detail, but maybe thanks to the podcast, they've understood a bit more about the topic. But of course, it's a very complex subject. And especially with NIS2, and we'll get to the topic of the Cyber Resilience Act later, more and more people in this supply chain are being affected. So even companies that might not have had anything to do with it before. And then I keep seeing the issue now, especially with DORA. And you can tell me in a moment what you think about it, that there's always this attempt to just shift everything onto the supply chain with a sledgehammer approach. You know, here first you get 10 Excel sheets and then you get this assessment and that assessment. And I want you to sign this as well. And please, if possible, sign it in blood so that everything works out. Which, especially in many companies that are dealing with this topic for the first time, definitely leads to people kind of, well, I'd say putting up walls and saying, no, I'm not responsible for this. I can't do it. And just leave me alone with this topic, which is actually counterproductive for security.
Absolutely. I agree with you there. And then you eventually reach a point where only the lawyers are talking to each other. And that's not really a foundation for a trusting collaboration. And in the end, that's also more valuable than what's written on paper, even though what's on paper should, of course, also be watertight. But the ideal case is that you don't even have to refer to it, but that everything just runs smoothly.
Yes.
And I think there are two key aspects to that. On the one hand, the supply chain, I think I haven't gone into enough detail on that yet, means that I not only have to look at my own service providers, but also at their service providers who are relevant within the scope of the service. And of course, they also have to meet these requirements. And this becomes increasingly fragmented, especially when we work with startups, because no matter how big a company is, the landscape of service providing suppliers is always heterogeneous. And that is also a major problem. We all want to implement AI and other great modern topics in our companies, but often you need niche providers for that. And the niche providers who may have been working intensively on their topic for the past 3 years are often not so well positioned when it comes to information security. You can't really expect otherwise, because if you have a company with 5 to 25 people, where are you supposed to get the capacity from? And you can't assign someone to focus exclusively on information security either. That's understandable.
You're really hitting the nail on the head for me with that. Let me give you an example from my own past. I've also worked a lot in the automotive industry, including with suppliers. And anyone who's worked in the automotive sector knows this. TSAX, a classic topic. Everyone who works in the automotive industry, all the suppliers in this whole field are part of the automotive sector. My God, you see, it's already late. Those who are in the automotive industry often work with TSAX certificates. And back then, I helped design an assessment for TSAX for a major German manufacturer. And what I always found interesting about it was that everything was lumped together. Just as you said, it doesn't just affect IT service providers. There's another example. We once had a marketing agency that shared various images, maybe even of prototypes, so different image files, and certainly some, let's say, more sensitive data as well as less sensitive data. And that was, let's say, a 5-person company, and they just slapped TSAX on them. Now go do TSAX, and then we'll work with you. On the one hand, I can understand that you somehow have to pass on your standards, but on the other hand, I always miss a bit of practicality and a sense of proportion. That's something you often find written in laws. We'll get to that later. There always has to be some kind of benefit, right? I've forgotten the exact term now. Maybe it'll come to me later, but there has to be a... That's right, exactly. Risk-based approach. In the end, it has to be a balance between benefit and risk. And most of the time it was like this. People would try from the top down to just impose, let's say, this 100%, even though it's never really 100%, but they try to dictate from above, okay, now do it like this, and that's that. Without giving any thought to what that actually means for this company or this organization. And how high is the actual risk really in relation to, let's take another example, instead of a marketing company, let's say I had the classic IT service provider who then has some of my data or maybe even access to my systems. So this balance between usability and security, which I always talk about, applies just as much to the issue of applicability when it comes to service providers. How much security do I need to require from the service provider, or how well can I secure myself so that the service provider might not need to meet 100% of TISAX, but only needs to fulfill certain parts of it in order to, as you said, have a harmonious relationship with the service provider in the end?
Yes, and I think you also need to have a bit of flexibility there. So the risk-based approach is something I always like to emphasize. And I think it's also important to take a pragmatic approach. I know there are many who say it has to be the 100% solution, but at the same time, we all agree that we will never achieve 100% risk avoidance. And from a business perspective, that's not even something you want. That would be completely uneconomical. It has to fit the company, its risk appetite, and you also have to pay close attention to the specific service. Not every service carries the same risk, and not every service provider carries the same risk. And even if a startup is involved in a risk issue, then maybe even if you really want to work with Theme After All as information security, we are also service providers within the company. You have to find a viable solution together with the business. And that viable solution could also be, for example, if the service provider doesn't have the capacity for a penetration test, then we pay for it, or you find a solution together. I'm not saying that we always do that, but that would be, for example, a solution that could be discussed where you simply share the responsibilities or consider adjusting the technical setup a bit. Of course, it's always easier to take a super standardized approach. That would make things easier for me as well. We would probably reject 70% of our cases or service providers, and we would get through our assessments very quickly. But then the company wouldn't be able to operate economically anymore, nor work with the service providers. They need to stay future-oriented and forward-looking.
And isn't that in the end just security by obscurity? So if I just say we want to achieve 100% come hell or high water, and then we're secure, and in the end we have a great management report where everything is green, that's also the flip side of the coin. So let's be honest, how many service providers actually fill out these supplier assessments, TSACs, pre-audits, and whatever else they're called, with a real sense of responsibility? If we're being honest, from a sales perspective, it's more like, okay, we have to get this done somehow. So we just write something down. I catch myself doing it. Toehan, someone comes up to me and says, hey, come on, lay it all out and show me everything you've got. Yeah, of course, you always try to find some way around it, right? I don't mean that people cheat, but rather that you explain things to someone or say, yes, we have that, but only at such and such a time. For me, it's always about what I actually get out of it at the end of the day. If the service provider just fills out their great checklist and I say, okay, I've done a supplier audit, so to speak, and now I'm safe, I can go back to sleep, that doesn't help either.
Yeah, I actually had an interview with a service provider recently that I thought was really, really good. It was also a comparatively smaller company, and I was quite impressed because they said, our goal is to grow together with you. And they said they appreciate any feedback we give them, and they actually implemented it, which I find remarkable, and that's how it should be. We want to develop together, and I think you also have to ease some of the fears on the security side, because many people only know the 100% approach and assume that if they fill out the questionnaire incorrectly, it means that because of them, no business will be done due to security. Of course, that's a bit of a sword of Damocles and not so great, yeah? And you just said, that's it. I actually think it's more like compliance by obscurity. So the fact that we don't talk about security, that's one thing. It looks great for an auditor when you say we have our standard here and only ISO 27001 certified companies are allowed into our supply chain. But whether that's actually secure, well, that's a whole different story because I don't look at them anymore. I also don't engage with the service anymore or consider how it fits into the company and the system. It's trust built on sender certified risk.
Yes, and on the other hand, I have to say, to give a completely different example, I also see this in tenders, you know. There are always those detailed requirement and specification documents listing everything that needs to be fulfilled, and you have to check things off back and forth. I always think to myself, in the end, who actually has the time to verify all of that? And it's exactly the same with suppliers. Who really has the time for that? Unless maybe you're a large corporation with 500 people working in information security, right? They might be able to afford it, but which normal isn't the right word, but which companies can really afford to invest a lot of time into these supplier-related issues? Hardly any company actually has the time for that. And that's why I also think, especially when we're talking about supplier sand, in a moment we'll talk about the elephant in the room, I believe, or at least I would really wish that we move more towards, as you said, building something together so that we can grow together on these topics, that we can also grow partnerships, and that we maybe see this as an opportunity to get even closer with our partners. Because of course, when you're, let's say, performing open heart surgery in various security and compliance teams, you naturally create a completely different sense of unity. And I think that should be the focus when we talk about supply chains, that we work together more and that we maybe also admit to ourselves where we're not so strong. And as you already said, just as an example, maybe you say, look, you might not be able to afford a pen test right now, but we want to do it together. Maybe I pay for it, or we split it 50-50, or we do it in some other way so that we're always looking for a joint solution instead of saying, well, dear service provider, if you don't have the means, then you're off my list. And that brings us back to another topic, which is also one of my favorites. We've already talked about a digital sovereignty. We don't have the option of having 15 service providers on hand and saying, okay, this one won't do it, so I'll just go to the next. So even there, we have problems, because to some extent we are forced into our supply chain since there aren't 5,000 companies all doing the exact same thing.
And I think that's often underestimated because with Microsoft, for example, this kind of interchangeability just doesn't exist. I think many people are already aware that this also affects a lot of smaller service providers and niche suppliers. That just doesn't sink in for most people at all. So even when I think back to my time at the airport, you naturally have some pretty specialized machines there. And of course, there are only a few providers who offer certain systems. So you have to find solutions for that as well.
Yeah, and you're bringing it up, right? Especially this topic of Microsoft is one of my favorites. I mean, who has ever actually created a backup strategy with Microsoft, right? No one, honestly. I use Microsoft too, but especially companies now in the DORA context, and that's the case for you as well, who are now considering what's our backup strategy and what's our exit strategy. For me, that's a really simple question, you know? What is the exit strategy for Microsoft? So for me, that's also one of those topics where you just have to be honest. Sometimes there simply isn't an exit strategy, and that's why I have to maintain my supply chains, because I don't always have an exit strategy or a solution that I can quickly implement.
But what I also find quite interesting in the context of information security in the supply chain are, of course, the various efforts to aggregate ratings of service providers on platforms. So you can also get information there. Of course, the significant problem is that these particular approaches often don't seamlessly fit into one's own specific company context. But I am quite confident that sooner or later, a truly good and effective solution will certainly emerge. I also think it's still very important to emphasize that not just from a regulatory perspective, but also from common sense, it will remain necessary to at least carry out a basic review. So even when we think about ISO certificates, a platform can certainly take over the task of validating whether it's a valid certificate. Buta, whether it's fake, which we've actually encountered before, fake ISO certificates. What it obviously can't do is check whether it's really within my scope, within the scope of the service I'm requesting from the service provider.
Yeah, or whether it's, once again, the infamous broom closet that's certified, or something else I find quite interesting. I don't know if you've ever come across this case where someone simply got themselves certified according to a code of practice, which isn't even a real certification, but then just created a certificate under 27,000. And fun enough, this was actually a company, of course. I won't mention any names, that's fairly well known and a bit larger, where I thought to myself, okay, has no one at the company ever questioned whether it's even possible for me to present a certificate based on, well, on a code of practice, specifically under 27,000, which actually isn't even certifiable? But of course, you can set a code of practice for yourself. So I think that's also the case. And I agree with you, these kinds of portals, I just call them consumer portals or comparison portals, where I can, for example, check a company like Schufa, also regarding things like information security points. I'm a bit torn about that because I think the problem will be who validates this data, because we end up with the same problem again. Then once again, some kind of checklist gets filled out, some automatic score is calculated, whatever it may be. And then you're always listed in there, you know. I have exactly the same example right now with cyber insurance. I find that really fascinating because, well, cyber insurance policies are calculated based on how well you've protected yourself or how poorly you've protected yourself. But I've noticed that most insurers don't actually check that at all. They just take this questionnaire, which then becomes part of the contract. Yeah, okay, of course, you have to answer it honestly. But we all know that a yes or no answer is really difficult in the field of cybersecurity or even generally in compliance. So it's not always just yes or no. Sometimes it's yes, we do it this way and that way. And that could be considered a yes, but it could also be considered a no, depending on the evaluation. So I sat down with the insurer and asked, guys, how do you actually validate this? Well, if something actually happens and you want to make a claim, of course, we would then check, including through forensics, what actually happened. And then I almost had to laugh because I thought, okay, if it actually comes to that and the forensics get involved, I think there will be other problems to solve, or whether there will even be any traces left to show how things actually happened. I really doubt that. So again, who is actually validating the data that's in there? And that's why I think such a database is a good idea. And I also believe that in the finance sector, it's easier because you can focus more on those economic aspects. But purely from a compliance and information security perspective, I find it very difficult to imagine.
So I agree with you on that. As I said, the solutions I've seen so far, I'm glad that there are such approaches. But I also haven't found anything yet that's really a perfect fit where we could just sit back and say we don't have to do any more audits, hooray. And from a regulatory perspective, you also can't forget that you still always have to validate it. There's just no way around that. I also think that this can only be solved if, in the end, it's handled by the government, because the whole thing has another problem as well. The service provider who registers there is also the one who pays for it. And I also assume that if there are several platforms, there might be some rating shopping going on as well.
Bless you. Yes, sorry, I had to sneeze. So I think, yes, that's definitely an issue, and nationalization is probably the right approach. But what I think we really need to move towards is building a relationship of trust with the supply chains, meaning with the partners in the supply chains. And when you build trust, you can also say, look, Nico, I just have a problem here. I can't do this. So I was also honest, and my sales team always said, no, Nico, you can't say that. Well, you have to put a yes there. That's not possible. I always said, look, no, we can't in good conscience write a yes here. So I wrote no, but then I always added a really long explanation or why I see it that way. And I think that's more legitimate. But for that, you also need someone who actually reads through it, Especially in the tendering process, it's simple. There's a score, no, 0 points, bam, you're out. Usually the evaluation isn't even read through instead. They just look for a no. And if it's there, you're out. And I think we need to make that change so that people don't just pay attention to yes or no, but also to the quantitative, to the qualitative aspects in the background, where you really take a moment to consider, okay, is this really a no, or is it maybe a maybe, And I think that's also the difficult part behind it.
Of course, this also requires experience and competence on both sides, because it's difficult to assess. And as already mentioned, it can't always be approved in a standardized way. But I still find the topic very exciting, and I'm happy to be involved, because I think what makes everything around the supply chain so interesting is that people, systems, and processes always come together here. And I think nowhere else do you find such a concentration. And you also have the different departments involved. And I think that's also something you naturally have to do a bit better stakeholder management within the company and bring the business on board, saying, hey, things might not always run smoothly. And if they don't, then we'll support you, and together we'll find a solution. Or if it's really not possible, then that's a rare case, but it can happen too.
So let's talk about the elephant in the room, namely the Cyber Resilience Act. We've already talked about it at length at the Cybersecurity Summit, and we both agree that unfortunately the topic of cyber resilience, me goodness, the Cyber Resilience Act just doesn't get enough attention. We're always talking about DORA, we're always talking about NIS2, and the running joke is when NIS2 will actually arrive, right? But what's much more significant, and especially for our topic of supply chain, and actually even more important for many other topics, is the Cyber Resilience Act. And we already know when it's going to start, and for the most part, what it's all about. Why do you think we're not currently talking about the Cyber Resilience Act?
I think it's kind of the hope that maybe it will just pass us by. We saw the same thing back then with the GDPR. That's my favorite example for everything related to regulation. We also knew years in advance that the GDPR was coming. And I still remember very well how back then at my former employer, we suddenly went into a frenzy and started creating all these endless overviews, thinking, oh God, what is actually relevant for the GDPR now? Which processes do we need to consider? And everyone was still kind of hoping beforehand, maybe it won't actually be implemented like that after all. That's one thing. And on the other hand, I also think we have a bit of a problem when it comes to regulatory monitoring within companies. Maybe we can talk more about that later as well. It's just that's a topic that can quickly pass you by when new laws like that come into effect. And I also have the feeling, well, this is something that affects the product side now. And information security is currently practiced about 90% of the time, not necessarily on the product side, but rather we have an information security management system that's supposed to keep our processes running in order to keep the company operational. And for example, if I'm a manufacturing company, to ensure my production, very few actually have the products in focus yet. And that's why, understandably, there isn't anyone who has anchored responsibility for that either.
Yeah, and I think your example with the GDPR is great because I actually have an anecdote about that too. It was exactly the same at our company back then. And I found it so impressive, that last minute panic, we absolutely have to do something now. It felt like we were preparing for the next pandemic. Well, it wasn't COVID yet, but it felt like we were getting ready for COVID. And then there was this really interesting discussion like, okay, so what do we actually do if someone contacts us and wants information? That was the biggest fear, What if a former employee or current employee wants to request information from us? How do we actually do that properly? And then the interesting thing was that that management really focused on making sure it wouldn't turn into another data protection incident. So the first step was always to check who is this person anyway, With employees, it's easy. They can just go to the HR department, identify themselves, and so on and so forth. Back then, they spent a lot of money on an identification system. Some people might know it from when they open a new bank account, for example, because there are similar identification systems there as well. And the interesting thing was that apparently some other companies had the same idea, because the company that makes these identification systems or these systems for identifying people using IDs and so on really experienced a boom and gained quite a few new customers. And then this was so brilliant. Then they sent out a mass email to all their new customers, but forgot to use BCC and put everyone in CC instead. And then on the very first day we introduced this new system, I immediately had a data protection incident because I received their entire customer distribution list. And just for fun, I wrote to all 900, however many customers who had just been onboarded saying hello and welcome to the GDPR. So that kind of showed this last minute panic. And it also showed me a bit, as you mentioned, monitoring of regulations, right? Namely this cataleptic mode that we know from crises or incidents, that it also happens when it comes to regulations. So really, when you have about for us, it was about 2 months beforehand. I think then suddenly consultants were brought in and a lot of money was spent. Then, as I said, a process was introduced and suddenly money didn't matter anymore. Before that, budgets were always negotiated. But then it was like, no, we're just going to buy it now. We need it. We have to protect ourselves. And to wrap up the story, on the day the GDPR came into effect, only one employee reached out. And this employee had already announced 3 weeks earlier that he would be getting in touch. So a huge machinery was set up for, let's say, a high 5-figure amount, which in the end wasn't needed because only one person made an inquiry.
Of course, the same could happen with the Cyber Resilience Act, that this becomes a learning experience for many companies, just like with the GDPR. Now we're in the 6th, I think, or 7th year after the introduction of the GDPR. There have been a few shocking fines, but honestly, that was really for, I would say, gross negligence, and even calling them deliberate violations is putting it mildly. Otherwise, the fines that have been imposed so far are also, it's rather manageable. So for most people, that's still something you can pay out of petty cash. And of course, it could very well be that for many, this contributed to them saying, well, then we'll just pay the fine. It stings a little for a moment, but life goes on.
Just to say briefly, I agree with you because I'm seeing the same thing right now. For example, regarding the Cyber Resilience Act, there's also for companies that work with systems that communicate via radio, the new radio equipment directive, radio alarm directive, which is actually coming out this August. So basically in 2 months, that's also part of the bigger picture. And it again overlaps with similar content from the Cyber Resilience Act. It's also important for everyone who uses such products and so on and so forth. No one is talking about that either. And I think that we're a bit paralyzed by what happened with NIS2, you know? So I have to be fair and say that we as an industry, and by we, I always mean the cybersecurity industrium. I myself was working on the service provider side until recently. And it was like, for many people, there was this gold rush atmosphere, you know? Oh, NIS2, now we can sell things again. And now they need this and that back and forth. And even back then, I told my company, I said, guys, NIS2 is not going to be adopted by companies like that because, first of all, it hasn't been implemented into national law yet. It's not clear when it will be implemented and so on. But large companies have tried to milk this cow. And I think that in turn led many companies to simply give up and say, well, NIS2 isn't coming now either. Cyber Resilience Act is in 2027, so I don't really care about that yet. But as you already mentioned, the Cyber Resilience Act is no longer really about information security, but rather about product safety. And we all know, especially those of us from the manufacturing sector, how long it takes to adapt product cycles. That doesn't happen overnight, right? It always takes 3, 4, 5 years, even 10 years to change a product life cycle like that. I feel like that's just being taken a bit lightly because people just think, well, it's like NIS2, maybe it'll come, maybe it won't, who knows? But the fact that the Cyber Resilience Act doesn't need to be transposed into national law, but is already valid as it is, I think a lot of people forget that. And then it just happens that people prefer to talk about topics like DORA and NIS2 because that's what's currently in the media, and the Cyber Resilience Act just gets completely overlooked.
Absolutely. And in my opinion, it's actually the more interesting regulation. Because, well, of course, DORA and NIS2 are also important, but with DORA, at least in Germany, it doesn't really affect many new companies. We already had BATE, Virginia IT, and KIT before for the financial service providers. Of course, there was some additional effort involved, that's true, but they weren't surprised and didn't have to build an entirely new system from scratch. With NIS2, some more being added, but it still hasn't been implemented into national law. And the Cyber Resilience Act, again, affects the products. It's actually much more interesting for consumers because that's where I think we ultimately have a much bigger issue. So in my view, information security is already very well established and integrated when it comes to office processes in similar areas. That certainly looked very different 15 or 20 years ago. But when it comes to products, it's still a bit of a wild west, and the tasks that need to be done there will definitely be even more extensive.
And what I find really exciting, and I have to say, hats off to those who developed all this at the European level, is that for me, attaching it to the CE topic is exactly the right approach. Because that way, you really have something of value, since everyone in Germany knows what the CE mark means. Yes, of course, there is some abuse there as well. We don't need to explain that. And yes, it's also just a declaration of conformity, a certificate, which in quotation marks, many people simply sign off on and say, yeah, it'll be fine somehow. But at the end of the day, with the Cyber Resilience Act, they've now found a way to have something tangible, something everyone understands and can work with. And this doesn't just affect the companies that manufacture something, but also the companies that distribute products, right? The best example is China. How many products come from China to Europe? And these products also have to comply with the Cyber Resilience Act. And I find that super interesting because I recently had a conversation with a major Chinese manufacturer of electric engineering products, and they had no idea about this at all. You think maybe they also think, yeah, it's not that important for me, it'll work out somehow, and so on. And I think the problem with this Cyber Resilience Act and why people aren't really talking about it is because it's mainly the product side that's affected, while we're currently focusing a lot on communication in the areas of governance and, let's say, information security. That's also what the press is focusing on. I've never seen an article about product security, you know? Well, product security isn't really the right term either, but you know what I mean?
Yeah, and that also raises the question, in terms of responsibility, where in the company, do you actually assign someone who's responsible for the products, for information security? I also think it's a matter of expertise, because we're dealing with IoT and OT here, which is a bit more specialized. It's also a question of whether we need to build up more expertise in that, regardless of product life cycles. It's really an enormous task. And here again, we're back to the supply chain, because that's also something that, in my view, is often underestimated by the companies doing the purchasing. When I buy something, ideally, I pay attention to the CE marking, and maybe I also need to consider the Cyber Resilience Act from that perspective.
And above all, you're bringing up an important topic, the supply chain, right? For example, I already find it a fascinating challenge, my favorite topic, SBOMs, right? How do companies deal with SBOMs? I always use the classic example, just try to get an SBOM from Microsoft, right? You'd be surprised at how many open source libraries are suddenly inside something like Microsoft, right? So I did it just for fun once, and I think I did it for Teams. It was an endlessly long list. And even then you realize that's still not the final complete list. And again, for me, this brings up the topic we mentioned at the beginning, supply chains. How do I now get my supply chain on board so that this works? So right now, since I'm sitting on the other side, I have to look at how our suppliers are working with us. And I'm already in the process of getting all our suppliers on board and figuring out how we can technically create SBOMs. Because yes, we already receive the relevant hardware specs, we already get the necessary information, but we have a very, very large software development department. And when I ask them which libraries they use and which parts are being used, they all just look at me and say, well, here's a list, but it's not necessarily complete, So these are completely different processes that you have to implement, and where you really need to give it some thought. And I think now is the right time for me to really address these topics with our suppliers. Maybe this is also a call to action for you. If you realize that your suppliers have never heard of this topic, or at least you don't get the impression that they've ever heard about it, then take the initiative and talk to them about it. Because these processes, they don't just happen overnight, Especially if you're a manufacturing company and you now have to create a detailed bill of materials, which has always kind of existed, but now needs to be much more in depth. You need to gather all that information yourself first. That's something that doesn't happen overnight.
I also think it's really important, especially regarding the supply chain, to point out what the actual scope of the Cyber Resilience Act is, because we're not just talking about hardware that ends up sitting there. Of course, that also has a significant risk profile, and especially a large risk profile, but we're talking about all products with digital elements. That could also be an app that's distributed in the App Store. It could also be any other kind of software. And I think it's really important to be aware of that. That means it could also affect your own company, even if you're not a manufacturing business, but rather a financial services institution offering an app in the App Store for your customers. Then that's definitely something that could be relevant under the Cyber Resilience Act.
And what's interesting about this, and let's not forget, is both software and hardware. That also means, as I've seen with some of our partners, we're not just talking about software being important, but also that the software controls hardware, right? Manufacturing companies, various robots, different types of control technology, and so on. So I don't just need an SBOM for my software, but also an SBOM for my hardware. And there, I have to combine the components of my software and hardware into one product, or I do it separately. So even there, I recently had an interesting discussion with one of our suppliers about what that looks like purely from a delivery perspective. So what will a product look like in the future? Is the product just software now, or is a product both software and hardware, or are hardware and software separate? So those are also interesting discussions that you should start having now to start thinking about how to deal with the Cyber Resilience Act in the future.
It's not just that. When it comes to the topic of SBOM, on the one hand, I requested from my service provider, but I also claim that on the other side, there aren't that many companies yet that have really dealt with the question of how to actually process it on their end. Because if you have such a bill of materials, you have to be able to analyze it automatically. Well, I certainly wouldn't sit down and spend 2 hours reading through Microsoft's SBOM. And you might even receive it in pieces. And if the Cyber Resilience Act comes into effect, you'll be sent tons of them. And I know some of the auditors myself and have had both fruitful and less fruitful discussions with them. And I'm pretty sure that in an audit from 2027 onwards, there will be an auditor sitting there saying, you're getting all these SBOMs now. So what are you actually doing with them? And if you just shrug your shoulders and say, no idea, I just file them away in the trash, then they probably won't be too thrilled about that either.
Yes, and that would go directly against the reason why we're supposed to have SBOMs. Because we're supposed to have SBOMs sent, to be fair, I have to say, I think it's important so that we can finally get an overview of the bigger picture. Because when we talk about vulnerabilities, we've repeatedly had the problem in the past that somewhere in the open source sector or some library or whatever was affected. Maybe it had a CVE or an exploitant. Suddenly a lot of other systems were impacted as well because they use that library, right? Or also, if I want to do effective vulnerability management, then I can't just look at the surface of the software, but I also have to look inside the software and see what's actually included in it. And that's why I think the aspect of SBOMs is good. I would also support it, but I agree with you. You always need a process to deal with it. And I agree with you there. You can't do that manually. And a typical, let's say, scanner can't even do that. It can't tell you, for example, that Microsoft now consists of 15 or 5,000 different components, and I'll just scan all of that. It just takes a superficial look, sees, okay, there's a vulnerability from Microsoft, there's a CVE, and that's it. But as we've all seen in recent months, even something like a vulnerability database can quickly run into trouble if a certain gentleman across the pond simply decides to cut the funding. So even there, we have to think about how, as a company, we can handle this information. And I see a lot of potential here, but I also see a lot of how should I put it? And maybe this is a good segue into the topic of how do I actually monitor regulations? Because in the end, I also see a lot of paper tigers, because then you end up with something where I've just put ink on paper just to document something, you know? And just recently, I had this discussion again with the auditor where I was told I should do it this or that way. And in the end, I said to the auditor, look, the way I do it isn't really relevant to you. The result is what's important, you know, because then he started arguing with me saying, no, you have to do it this way and that way. And it only works like this. And we said, no, that's not right. First of all, you're not even allowed to tell me how you want it done. You have to go by the audit situation. I'm an auditor myself, so I know that. And secondly, it's the case that the path ultimately leads to a goal, and the goal is what's important. And no matter how I reach this goal, I can do it slower, faster, less efficiently, more efficiently, but in the end, I achieve my goal. And that's how I deal with it. And then I often see that the topic of regulation is more like a paper tiger. The main thing is just to have 200 pages saying, I've done everything. But is that really what the legislator wants to achieve with it? Or is that maybe the wrong kind of monitoring if in the end all I have are certificates saying I'm secure?
So you could also take a look at other European countries because all this regulation at the EU level affects them as well. However, they sometimes handle things differently. There, I'm not saying that the way it's done in Germany is wrong, but I do think that sometimes we might overthink things a bit. From my perspective, it just needs to be implemented and lived out in a sensible way. But unfortunately, the auditors don't always see it that way. But it also reminds me a bit of raising children. I have a son as well. He's 5 years old. And if I set 200 rules for him at home, he might follow 2 of them, and the other 198 he'll forget right away. And I think that's something we have to take into account as well. When we implement all these regulations in our company, someone actually has to work with them afterwards. And especially when it comes to the IT colleagues, because it usually affects them. If they have to wade through 200 policies, they'll just tune out as well. That just doesn't work. So you really have to urgently regulate the topics that are truly high risk, and everything else just what makes sense. So here too, you have to follow a risk-based approach. And of course, as I said, it has to fit the company's risk appetite. Otherwise, it usually just leads to a complete defensive attitude. Everything about compliance and governance is annoying, and people just stop doing anything, which is not what we want.
All right. But now let me give you a bad example. Let's say a very, very, very provocative example. Now, it's often the case, please, not everyone should feel addressed by this, but quite often I have a management team that sometimes has little understanding of the topic. So they don't really grasp why these regulations exist. I don't want to say that they don't understand at all how important this is. I think there are very few management teams left that don't understand that, let's say, information security, cybersecurity, and the like are among the most important business risks. I don't think you need to explain that to anyone anymore. So if someone still doesn't get that today, well, there's really nothing more you can do for them. But I'll put it this way. The approach is usually more like, okay, I always have my risk matrix here and everything is green, and then I feel great. Because if I go to my management now and say, look, here's something orange or here's something red, then there's real trouble and I'll get a lot of questions. And no, that's just super annoying. So I end up tending to think in terms of a classic traffic light system, just trying to set everything to green, then I have less stress and my management is reassured. And in most cases, management doesn't really ask whether it's actually green or if it's truly red or indeed really orange or what exactly was done in a comprehensive manner. In the end, it's more like, oh, everything's perfectly green. That's absolutely great. Let's promptly move on to the very next topic.
I just say, of course, it's also a bit our job as security professionals to explain things properly. I also always find traffic light systems dangerous. I mean, if you look at road traffic, just because the light is green doesn't mean there isn't a major accident behind it or that I won't end up stuck in traffic anyway. So yes, I think you really have to cluster the risks sensibly and clearly explain what's actually behind them. And I'd say, just as it can't be that everything in a company is on red, it also can't really be that everything is on green. I mean, I think we've both been doing this job far too long not to know that, unfortunately, things don't always run smoothly.
What I also find interesting, which has been introduced with DORA, is that management is explicitly, I don't want to say, well, actually, you can say they've been made liable, and that's explicit as well. There's also, I've forgotten the exact passage, but there's definitely a section that says they can't pass on the risk, or rather they can't hand over the responsibility, right? And that's when I noticed for the very first time when I did a training session with management, it was a completely different topic, So when you suddenly brought up that point and said, usually the standard reaction was, well, that's what we have you for, Mr. Werner. You'll take care of it, right? Or now we have a consultant, he'll take care of it now. And then I explicitly said in the meeting, look, no, DORA makes it very clear. That's absolutely ruled out, You are still responsible for it and you can't just delegate that away. That's when I noticed management suddenly saw things very differently. They actually questioned that 3 or 4 times. They also brought in a lawyer who answered it again and so on. And then the level of attention on the topic was completely different. Do you think that's the right approach when we're talking about monitoring, let's say, regulatory matters or even compliance monitoring, that we need to talk more about the issue of liability?
Well, the goal is, of course, first and foremost, that liability doesn't have to be invoked at all. That's one thing. But on the other hand, yes, I do think so. I really do. So regulation as a whole, many people talk about overregulation. And to be honest, we're all groaning under the weight of it because there's a lot to deal with and a lot to implement. But I still think it's important because voluntary self-commitment hasn't really worked all that well over the years, which I can understand. After all, companies only have a limited budget. And as a CEO who thinks economically, I would also consider where it makes the most sense to invest my money. And if, in fact, there are no significant consequences for me, then I would also be more likely to shift the money elsewhere. But if regulations are pushing and saying you have to do something here, then even the last holdout will find it hard to resist.
Yes, but what I also noticed, Baitan, feel free to share your opinion on this, is that regulations are often duplicated or even triplicated. So what do I mean by that? A classic example, maybe I'm affected by DORA, then I'm affected by NIS, and in the end, I'm also subject to the Cyber Resilience Act, and then the REI Act comes on top, and then this, and then that. And often it's, yes, we want to improve safety or we want to improve security. And in the end, they all have a similar structure or ultimately aim for the same goal. But one requires this, the other requires that. Do you think that's also a problem when we talk about monitoring, that you first have to get an overview of what actually exists out there?
Absolutely. And that's also an issue that probably isn't as pronounced everywhere, but especially in medium-sized businesses and smaller organizations, who actually takes care of that? Here too, the legal department is often heavily involved in handling the classic legal topics and doesn't necessarily have everything related to cybersecurity and regulation on their radar, especially since scoping is also difficult for them to grasp, as it sometimes requires quite extensive expertise. And yes, this double regulation, that's true, although I would like to point out the recitals in this too, which if you fall under other specialized regulations, do allow for certain exemptions. because NIS2, for example, has a very similar scope to DORA. But otherwise, yes, and it's not just the Cyber Resilience Act, the Red Directive and DORA, but there are also many others which tend to fall more into the area of data protection, like the Data Act and so on and so forth. And keeping track of what the actual goal of all this is really not easy. And I also think that this often gets a bit overlooked in the press. Just last week, I put together a nice overview of all the regulations that the EU has issued as part of, I believe, the Cybersecurity Strategy 2020. And I couldn't find such a comprehensive and complete overview on the internet, at least not one that was visually appealing.
I'm absolutely with you on that. And that already raises another question. What can I actually do to stay up to date? Because I noticed it myself. I go on vacation for 2 weeks and the world has completely changed. It feels like there are 1,000 new things. That doesn't just apply to, let's say, the cybersecurity field. It affects various other areas as well. But especially in our field, the pace of change is so fast and so rapid. And you also mentioned it, which is exactly what I always tell companies. Everyone is always talking about NIS2, DORA, and the Cyber Resilience Act, but behind all that is a huge EU program that was decided years ago, and these are all just sustainable steps now. For example, no one talks about the AI Act, even though it's been around for a long time. So to really stay on top of things, what is your recommendation? Of course, apart from listening to my podcast, because that's where you always get all the information.
Definitely stay in touch and keep exchanging ideas. Maybe also talk to the right people. You mentioned earlier, for example, with NIS2 and the consultants. Yes, back then I also spoke with a few and only ever heard about NIS2. No one pointed out the other regulations to me either. So I think the most important thing is to stay connected and keep exchanging information. There are also many associations through which you can request information and stay in touch.
Maybe one last question, then we'll have wrapped up our topic complex, so to speak. We still had the topic of zero trust. My favorite topic, which as always leads to everyone having a different definition of zero trust in all sorts of areas. Maybe for you, what does zero trust mean to you?
So if I'm being a bit provocative, I'd say at first glance it's a nice buzzword because everyone understands something different by it. And before we get to the definition, I have to say I'm always a bit reserved when it comes to zero trust. So while it always sounds nice, in fact, ever since I've been working in information security, zero trust has been more of a side topic because the main entry points that affect most companies are always the same issues, especially identities and especially certain systems that weren't the focus when it came to securing them. And that's exactly the risk I see with implementing zero trust, that you end up applying zero trust principles to your crown jewels while some small supposedly non-critical SaaS solution is just floating around somewhere on the network without two-factor authentication with, I don't know, admin 123 as the power user password. So I'm a bit cautious when it comes to zero trust. It would be great if we were all at the point where we could consistently implement zero trust everywhere. But I think that most companies still have a lot of other basic homework to do first.
I completely agree with you. For me, it's also a buzzword because everyone understands something different by it. And what I always find so difficult about zero trust is that people always say, you can't trust him, and you have to work with us because we have and you know the rest. And I think to myself, yeah, and who guarantees me that you don't have any problems of your own? It's the same with the Huawei debate, or no, right? Back then, I'll admit it, at my previous company, I was one of the people who spoke in favor of it and said, since we were a Huawei partner at the time, hey, listen, let's give Huawei a chance. Not because I was saying they're especially secure, especially insecure, but because even then I said, look, guys, the real question isn't whether Huawei is secure or insecure. The real question is simply, how do I integrate a Huawei device into my network in a way that ensures the highest possible security? Who can guarantee me that Cisco, Nokia, or any of the others who have also been involved in the 5G sector aren't being monitored by intelligence agencies as well? No one can tell me that, right? And then people always come up with these arguments, yeah, but they've made their source code public and so on. Yeah, that's just bullshit too. Who's to say that's actually the source code? So this whole topic, this whole thing around zero trust to me is just a huge bubble where people are just trying to sell something new again. But as you already said, they're simply forgetting the basic building blocks, right? Because I can easily implement zero trust by simply taking the defense in depth approach from OT, looking at it and just saying, look, I need as many layers as an onion around my system so that I know exactly if something does happen. Then I have my first layer to catch it, then maybe my second, and so on. So I simply have to come up with several, let's say, concepts for how I can make technology secure in my context. And that's exactly what people tend to forget, because they say, okay, now I have some zero trust technology and that will take care of everything.
As always, good technology and good tools can't make up for bad processes. So it's really a process issue. We need to know our processes. We need to have them under control. And that applies to the entire landscape. And that's where the challenge lies.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed talking with you, Katia, especially about the topics that are close to your heart. We already noticed at the Cybersecurity Summit how passionate you are about this topic. Maybe as a final question, and this one is personal, where do you think we'll end up in 20 years? Will we end up with overregulation? Will we be living in a Germany that's 90% secure, where everything is great and wonderful? Or will we still be talking about exactly the same topics in 20 years?
I always believe in the good. So I don't think we'll see even more regulation. I am quite hopeful that the approach the EU has taken with harmonizing the landscape is now complete. And I think in 20 years, we'll still be talking about similar topics because cybersecurity is, well, complex and it takes time to really implement it everywhere. I hope there will be some topics we no longer have to discuss. But what I definitely believe is that in 20 years, we will have made more progress in product safety, especially regarding information security. And I would personally be very happy if we were 90% secure. I might be a bit too pessimistic about that, but we're doing our best to get there.
How do they always say it in school? We always did our best, right? That's the grade you get for that. Thank you for this great, exciting episode. That's it from Cybersecurity Chefsache, the podcast, and we'll hear and see each other next time. See you then.
Thank you very much.